Yes, that one.
Isn't that the
Yeah,
Zoom?
that's the right one. Share screen too. That one. Share. Perfect.
So yeah.
All right, great. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Excellent. All right, so thank you very much for the introduction, Rabbi Chessis. As you said, I am a psychologist at McLean Hospital, where I specialize in the treatment of people with borderline personality disorder who tend to struggle with suicidality and self-harm. I have particular interest in treating anxiety disorders like panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, and OCD. In my clinical practice, I use cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, which are both practical problem-focused treatments that are meant to provide specific strategies for people to manage their emotions more effectively. Let's see. Over there. In CBT and DBT, we focus on changing behavior rather than generating insight. In this talk, I'll draw on strategies taken from CBT and DBT. You'll notice that many of these will be common sense. Unfortunately, there's generally a pretty wide gap between people's common sense and their actual behavior. So I would challenge everyone listening to try to implement at least one strategy that you might hear if it seems like it would be relevant to you. Okay.
So now if you go to
Click on that one. This thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. All right, cool. Thank you, Jacob. Okay. So I'm going to start by introducing the concepts of fear, anxiety, and worry. So in psychology, we assume that emotions have evolved in humans because they helped our ancestors survive. So for example, the emotion of disgust leads us to reject toxic substances. Parental love motivates us to support and defend our offspring. Anger motivates us to take action against a source of threat. Didn't work the way I thought it was going to. Sorry. And shame leads us to signal that we have accepted a position of diminished social status. Fear and anxiety are closely related, but there are some differences between them. So although both are reactions to threat, fear is a response to immediate danger, whereas anxiety involves the anticipation of a future threat that isn't currently happening. When we're anxious, it's a response to a perceived threat that may never materialize. Anxiety is usually accompanied by distress, physical tension, and by worry. Worry is the cognitive component of anxiety and usually involves pessimistic predictions about future events. Anxiety can be either helpful or harmful depending on the situation. If anxiety motivates you to deal with an actual future threat, then it can be useful. Anxiety is unhelpful when it's more intense than the situation calls for, when it happens in response to things that aren't actual threats, when it interferes with our ability to accomplish goals, or when the threat is one over which you have no control. There is an optimal level of anxiety depending on the situation. There's research that shows that we actually need a certain level of anxiety to perform well. Anxiety helps motivate us. For example, if someone didn't feel anxious before taking a test, they'd be unlikely to study. But if you have too much anxiety, then you might panic and not be able to think clearly enough to perform well on the test. When anxiety is severe and chronic, it leads to many different problems. It can weaken the immune system, making us more prone to illness. It can lead to cardiovascular and digestive problems. It also affects our mental health and can lead to depression, substance abuse, and suicide. The current situation that we're all dealing with is one in which stress is a totally expected response. Stress tends to get worse when people are under economic pressure. The unemployment rate in this country is expected to go up to 20%, and a recent poll found that 55% of adults in the United States had either lost their job or had lower income due to the pandemic. Previous research has shown that there's a strong correlation between economic stress and increased substance abuse and suicide. One feature of this pandemic compared to other disasters is that we're expected to distance ourselves from others, which makes us more prone to loneliness and reduces our access to the kinds of social interaction that normally would have helped us feel better. So for example, if it was a tornado, we'd all be pitching in and helping out and taking care of each other. And this is the only kind of disaster I can think of where the proper way to deal with it is by not interacting with each other at all, or at least by not seeing each other in person. Obviously, the pandemic is causing many people to experience more physical illness, which can also exacerbate stress. Also, many of us will have lost someone or will lose someone that we know to coronavirus. but we don't have the normal social or religious communities that would have allowed us to feel supported. So what are some signs that you might be experiencing higher levels of stress? Sometimes it's obvious, but other times our symptoms don't seem to be obviously connected to a source of stress. We might read an article about coronavirus and not notice any anxiety immediately, but an hour later when we're no longer thinking about it, we might notice that we're feeling too activated to fall asleep. So these are some of the signs that might indicate that you're feeling a greater degree of anxiety or stress recently. The cognitive symptoms include worry thoughts, difficulty concentrating, hopeless thoughts about the future, avoidance of thoughts that generate distress. The physical symptoms include having an upset stomach, headache, fatigue, changes in appetite, difficulty sleeping, periods of increased heart rate, irritability, hypervigilance, having a heightened startle response. And the behavioral symptoms can include social isolation, reduction in activity levels, avoidance of triggers for anxiety, reassurance seeking, meaning like repeatedly asking people if you're okay, like, am I gonna be okay? Am I sick? Do you think this cough sounds bad? And avoidance of physical activities that elicit uncomfortable internal states. So some people might notice that they avoid doing things that, that lead to increased heart rate because the feeling of having their hearts beat faster reminds them of panic or feels scary to them in some way. COVID-19 seems to already be taking a measurable toll on mental health in this country. A recent poll found that 56% of adults in the United States experience a negative impact on their mental health, such as sleep difficulties, physical symptoms like headaches and stomach aches, and increased substance abuse. The numbers are even higher for those who have lost their jobs or income, as well as for those who live with a healthcare worker, which I think is particularly relevant for our community, where so many of us either work in the health field or live with people in the health field, or our children work in the health field. We're just so many doctors that we're all worried about somebody. There's also been nationally a huge increase in the use of crisis hotlines, suicide hotlines. So there's one government hotline had an 1,000% increase in calls from April 2020 versus April 2019. There's also been an increase in 85% in gun sales in this country. But again, not to say that's a sign of mental illness, but the idea would be that it's a sign that people are feeling under threat in some way. And I believe that something like several thousand, I think it was about 100,000 more first-time gun purchasers in this month than in the previous month. So yeah, there's this rapid increase in the amount of people buying guns because people are feeling fearful and they want to find ways to protect themselves. So I'd like to introduce you to CBT, which is the kind of therapy that I use when I treat anxiety. So CBT is based on the idea that our thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, and behaviors are all connected with each other, meaning that one impacts another. So the relationships are bidirectional. So for example, our thoughts affect our feelings. So when we're, so for example, if we're more likely to feel angry, we're more likely to feel angry if we're thinking about how someone has wronged us in the past. Our feelings also affect our thoughts, so we're more likely to remember having been wronged when we're already feeling angry. The goal of CBT is to help people notice and then change the patterns of thinking and behavior that are causing them difficulties. So many people now are struggling with worry thoughts. The world feels very uncertain and it's difficult to know which information to trust. So if we're trying to reduce worry, there are some strategies that might be helpful. The first is simply to notice your thoughts and evaluate their accuracy. You may notice that your anxiety is leading you to make extremely negative predictions about the future that don't necessarily match the known facts. Even if your worry thoughts are well founded in the facts, you may notice that they don't lead you towards any practical solutions. Spending a lot of time focusing on these thoughts is unhelpful and only compounds your misery. When you notice getting stuck in an unhelpful chain of thoughts, try to redirect your attention to the present, focusing on things outside of yourself rather than inside your mind. It can be helpful to think of a mind as a kind of a train station. We can't control which thoughts arise in our minds any more than we can choose which trains arrive at the station. But we do have the choice of whether to get onto the train or whether to watch it pass by. So similarly, we can either get on board the train with our thoughts and stick with them and ride them for hours, or we can notice that they're there and get off the train, or we can even let them pass by after we've noted them. If exposure to the news is triggering rumination, then it's probably a good idea to limit your exposure to the news, which we'll discuss further. So unless we make a conscious choice to control our minds, worry tends to progress in a chain of more and more upsetting thoughts. So here's an example that some of you may have experienced. So you might have the thought, why does my throat feel sore? Or just show of hands, how many people have thought they had coronavirus so far? Anybody? Am I the only person who's like sure at one point that I had coronavirus? Yeah, it's there's so many things, so many symptoms. It seems like you look at the CDC website and every day there's like another 10 new symptoms that might signal the possibility of coronavirus. So I think, yeah, it makes sense for any of us that have this fear. So you might notice the thought like, why does my throat feel sore? You think, I definitely have coronavirus, I should go get tested. And then you might think, what if I don't have coronavirus now, but if I go to the doctor for testing, then I'll get it. And then you might think, well, what if everyone gets it and there's no immunity and it mutates and it's the end of civilization? So yeah, to break the chain of thoughts, you might want to ask yourself whether your thoughts are helping you to solve a real world problem. And in this case, there is no real problem to solve. The ultimate fate of civilization, unfortunately, seems to be outside our hands. People also tend to worry more in the evening when they have the least ability to do any practical problem solving. Okay, so this decision tree might help you figure out what to do with your worry thoughts. So you would first ask yourself what it is that you're worrying about. Next, you ask yourself if the worry that you're having is one that you can actually do something about. If the answer is no, then you try to let the worry go by redirecting your attention elsewhere. You can do some kind of distracting activity, hang out with people, whatever it is, but to try to move your mind to some other topic. If there is something that you can do about the problem, then you want to make a list of your options. You can write it down. It's often helpful to take notes to kind of externalize the thoughts and get them outside of your mind. If you can see them physically, often they feel a lot less threatening. If there is something you ask yourself, is there something I can do to solve the problem in this moment? If the answer is no, then you make a plan for what you will do and when you'll do it, and then you direct your attention elsewhere. You put that time in your calendar, make a specific plan for when you're going to deal with it. If there is something that you can do in this moment, then you do that thing now, and then you redirect your attention elsewhere. You try not to let your mind build towards finding a new problem to solve. You try to redirect towards something else. Another strategy that's helpful is to put boundaries around your worry by scheduling a consistent block of time each day dedicated only to that purpose. So this can be particularly helpful if you experience your worry as time-consuming or difficult to control, and also if you believe that it's beneficial to engage in worry when it occurs. So for example, some people might believe that, that if they don't worry, something bad is going to happen. So they might think that, that if I stopped worrying about this thing, then maybe I won't be ready to deal with the problem when it arises. So these are the steps that you would follow for scheduled worry time. So the first step is preparation. So you try to stick to the same location and the same time every day. You choose somewhere where you won't be disturbed. Ideally, it's an uncomfortable spot, not in your bedroom, because you don't want your bedroom to become associated with anxiety-provoking thoughts. You want it to be uncomfortable so that you won't get too comfortable sitting there and kind of reinforce the behavior just because it's a comfortable location to sit. You start by setting aside 15 to 30 minutes when you can fully focus and dedicate yourself completely to the goal of worrying. Step 2 is worry postponement. So over the course of the day, when worries arise, if they present a problem that you can solve, then you solve the problem. If the problem can't be solved, then you tell yourself, I'm not going to engage this thought now. I'm going to save it for this evening. You can write it down so that you make sure that there's no way that you'll forget to worry about this thing. And then you redirect your attention to the present moment. Step 3 is your worry time. So you try to use the entire allotted time for the worry, even if your thoughts aren't bothering you that much at that moment. So if you set aside, if your plan was to spend 30 minutes worrying, then you need to spend full 30 minutes worrying and doing nothing but worrying for that entire period of time. Then you reflect on your worries afterwards, and you may notice that when you reflect on your worries, that they're not as emotionally charged now as they were when it first arose. Then you would ask yourself if any of your worries can be converted into practical solutions. And if there is a problem, again, if there's a problem to be solved, then by all means solve it. You may notice that 30 minutes was excessive, that you didn't need 30 minutes. So then the next night you might set aside 25 or 20, and you would work your way down until you figured out what is the optimal amount of time to spend worrying, and then you make sure that you actually follow through every day, even if you don't feel like it. And again, the goal is to do this not to increase the amount of worrying that you're doing, but to allow you to give yourself permission not to worry when the thought arises at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when you're supposed to be doing something else, when you're supposed to be hanging out with your kids. It's a way for you to remind yourself, don't worry, I'll still have time to worry. Okay. The CDC has recommended that people limit their exposure to the news to help reduce anxiety. Media companies know that people pay more attention to things that generate negative as opposed to positive emotion. So there's that that famous quote, "If it bleeds, it leads." So people notice things that signal threat. It makes evolutionary sense for us to focus on threats because the consequences of a bad decision are usually so much more impactful than the consequences of a good decision. So if you were to imagine, like the worst thing that could happen to you is so much worse than the best thing that could happen to you is good. There's no equity between those two things. The worst is so much worse than the good is good. So it's been said that life has to win every day, but death only has to win once. And that's the reason that people are again, have evolved to pay close attention to threats. The consequence is that the news makes us see the world as more dangerous than it actually is. And this is true even in the current climate where we're all, it makes sense for any of us to be worried about our safety and about the safety of our family members. Even then, it's still probably true that our anxiety is leading us to be more fearful than makes sense. So these are some strategies that could help if you notice that watching the news is making you more anxious than you'd like to be. So you would seek information only to the extent that it helps you make practical plans. So meaning that you wouldn't watch 3 hours of the news when there's nothing on it that's actually practically valuable. You turn off notifications on your phone or leave your TV remote in a different room so that you have to make a conscious decision to expose yourself to the news, as opposed to having the news just pop up every time you look at your phone. You seek information only certain times of day, maybe once in the morning, once in the early evening, again, so that you're not constantly looking at information that makes you feel anxious. If these things aren't enough, then you can ask someone you trust to act as your filter and ask them only to share information to you that they deem to be important. So so for example, when the CDC changed their guidelines around mask use, that's useful information. That was something that previously it said we shouldn't wear. And they said that we should. That is important information to know. That might be the only piece of important information I can remember hearing in a long time. So the idea would be, if there's anyone that you know who you feel you can trust to give you, to share with you only the useful information, then they ask them to do that. And then when you're deciding not to watch the news, you want to think also about what are you going to replace that behavior with? What are you going to do instead? So if you were going to listen to the news, you realize it's making you anxious, instead make a plan to listen to music. So it's like mitzvah say, not just losa say. Like identify the things that you are going to do, not just the things that you're not going to do. So many people are also dealing with increased feelings of loneliness as a result of social distancing. Under normal circumstances, most of our social interactions over the course of the day are unplanned. So we go for a walk and we run into someone, we make small talk before a meeting, we talk about things that don't have much informational purpose. And so the goal of a lot of communication, whether we're conscious of it or not, is about demonstrating closeness to other people. It's not really about information. It's more about a sign of affiliation with other people. So now the world has changed so that now we have to make a conscious choice and intentionally schedule all social interaction. And this reduces the kind of casual, non-purposeful contact that we would normally have, meaning that we have way less contact with other people. And we don't have the kinds of conversation that don't have any practical value, which really, when you think about it, is most of the conversation that we normally have. For those of us who are more socially anxious, we might be less likely to contact people because we're unsure about what to say and whether the other person wants to talk. Social distancing can feel like a relief for people who are more introverted, but being social animals, our mental health tends to worsen when we're isolated. And this is true even for people who are introverted. So some strategies for increasing social support, social connection when we're physically distant. So the first is ask people for support. One of the best gifts you can offer someone is to ask them for help. When you ask someone for anything, even when you're just calling them and asking them to talk, you're telling them implicitly that you feel close enough to them, that you feel comfortable asking them for something, that they matter enough to you, or that you feel that the relationship is mutual in the sense that they would be happy to talk to you also. And that communicates to them that you're available to them if they need you also. And you're also communicating to them that you value their opinion if you're asking them for advice. A good idea to check in with people even if you haven't spoken for a while. So I think for myself, I can't remember the last time someone did something nice for me or said something kind and I didn't appreciate it. So I think we often worry that if we contact someone, they're going to think that it's weird. They're going to be like, well, why is this person calling me? I haven't talked to them in a year. But I can't remember the last time that happened for me where someone contacted me and I thought to myself, this is weird. Why is this person calling me? I really have only appreciated it. So this is the only time in history that we've had the technology to reach people across the world and also been sure that they're also bored, lonely, or stressed. It's a truly unique experience that we're all having where you can make a reasonably certain guess about what almost everyone you know is doing right now, which is nothing at all. So people are there. And it's also important, I think, for you to ask yourself if you might be the person who could make a difference in someone else's life right now. You might not know that you are that person, and you might not know that the person would really value and benefit from talking to you, but you might be that person. So I've thought for myself about how lucky I am to be with people I love, but this isn't universally true for everybody. So if you know someone who's alone or who's in a stressful home environment, consider reaching out to them and let them know that you're thinking of them, because I'm sure that they would appreciate it. Okay. So sleep. So many people are dealing with sleep difficulties due to the changes in daily structure and the increase in worry. So you can see there's this cycle where worry makes it more difficult to fall asleep. Creates this feeling of like physiological arousal, like your heart's beating faster. You're kind of jolted awake by these fear-inducing thoughts. Makes it harder to fall asleep. The harder it is to fall asleep, the poorer your sleep quality is, the harder it is to stay asleep. You wake up in the morning and you find that you have more difficulties with concentration. It's harder to solve problems. You're more prone to irritability and anger outbursts. You're more sad, more tearful. And that just generates more worry. And it keeps the cycle going where it becomes harder and harder to sleep and then harder and harder to manage your emotions. So it's very important to pay close attention to your sleep habits because they really do contribute very strongly to your daily emotional experience, to your ability to function in the world, and to your relationships with other people. And it's also really important if the goal is to maintain daily structure, which is also very important for mood. Obviously, sleep is a big part of your daily structure, big part of my daily structure. Okay, can't do this lefty, sorry, Noah. So here's some helpful strategies to improve sleep. So use your bed only for sleep, not for work, not for reading the news, not for eating meals. You make the environment in your room conducive to sleep. So try to minimize noise, keep it dark when you're going to bed, keep the room slightly cool. If you're having difficulty falling asleep, so a lot of the time people might feel like, let's say you've been laying in bed, tossing and turning for 45 minutes and you can't sleep. And you're just getting more and more stressed about the fact that you're not falling asleep. So the idea would be if the urge to sleep has passed, if you're not feeling tired anymore, don't lay in bed anymore. You have to get up and go do something else. Go read a book until the urge for sleep returns. But don't stay in bed ruminating about the fact that you're not able to fall asleep. It's helpful to try to start the day with direct sunlight to regulate your circadian rhythms because sunlight does help regulate your sleep-wake cycle. You want to avoid napping, as glorious as it is, unless it's Shabbos, in which case all bets are off, because it can make you it can make you less sleepy in the evening and throw off your daily sleep habits. You want to exercise once per day. Sorry, Pop, but you want to avoid alcohol. You don't have to. I mean, it's up to you. But because even though it can make you feel drowsy, a lot of people think that alcohol helps them sleep because it does induce feelings of drowsiness. But it also interferes with your REM cycles, so it makes sleep more refractory and less refreshing. And so you will wake up often feeling more fatigued than you would have even if you'd gotten less sleep. If you experience recurrent bad dreams, it's actually, there's some interesting research coming out about the content of people's dreams during this pandemic. And it's kind of what you would expect. People are dreaming more about illness and disease. They're dreaming more about bugs, which makes sense because we use the word bug to refer to a virus. So somehow that's kind of seeped into our dream world. People's dreams have been more vivid and memorable. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but I don't think I've had a nightmare in like years that I could remember up until very recently. And definitely my dreams have been more vivid and memorable. So if you notice that you're having these vivid bad dreams or recurrent nightmares, oddly enough, one of the things that's been shown to help is to try to imagine the nightmare scenario that you have been having during sleep, and you try to replace the ending with a more positive ending. So if the story usually involves with you getting caught, let's say, or you or a family member getting ill, something bad happening, you would try to remember the dream, imagine it as vividly as you can, but change the ending of the dream to make it something more positive. And that actually, if you do it before bed, can actually change the content of your dreams, which is strange. As I mentioned at the beginning, our bodies respond to threats or I thought I mentioned this, I'm not sure that I did, by activating the fight, flight, freeze response. So it's your body's kind of script for responding to danger. It prepares you for fighting, running away, and if either of those things doesn't work, then your body just shuts down. So I don't know if anyone's ever seen those goats that like you scare them and they just kind of flop over sideways. They just can't tolerate strong emotion. So the idea there is that they go limp as a form of self-protection. So when the fight, flight, freeze response is activated, the body mobilizes resources to deal with an immediate threat by shutting down unnecessary activities like digestion. At that point, if there's an imminent risk, your body is not any more focused on digesting food that it needs for the future. It's focused on getting you away from the present danger. So it diverts resources away from digestion, increases heart rate, redirects blood flow away from the brain and towards muscles and organs. Actually pulls blood away from the skin, which is why people get pale. And that makes it more difficult to think and regulate emotions. It limits sleep by making us more vigilant to danger and deprioritizes immune function. So the goal would be to increase relaxation by putting our bodies in the rest and digest mode. So I'm just noticing the time. I'm gonna skip through. So to reduce the physical symptoms of anxiety, you wanna do deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, grounding. If anyone's interested, by the way, I'm glad to email these slides afterwards because I know I'm not gonna get through everything. It's also important to build a more consistent daily structure into your day, setting goals and opportunities for learning, add time for daily activities. So pleasant event scheduling is really important. Depression, a lot of people think that depression is caused by having bad things happen, but it's been demonstrated that it's actually less about bad things happening and more about good things not happening. So in order to reduce the odds of developing depression, particularly if you're already prone to depression, you would want to make sure that you make time for hobbies, for time outdoors, and for other pleasant activities. When to seek professional help. If your anxiety or your moods are getting in the way of your ability to function, if they're causing you really significant distress, by all means, it's a good idea to contact someone and to talk about it. If you notice that you're not getting along with the person, then it makes sense to switch to someone else. Cool. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so just lastly, the last thing I want to say is that I think it's helpful to kind of reconsider the way that we're all thinking about this. Because one of the things that demonstrated in research is that to the extent that we feel that we have control over the situation, we're much less likely to feel anxious about it. So suffering largely results from the feeling of lack of control. And so we may feel in some way like the current circumstance where we're all stuck indoors all day, that we're victims of this, that there's all these things that we're losing, and that we're losing all these opportunities. There are things that we're not able to do. It's all this suffering in the world. So yeah, that only makes our anxiety worse. The truth is, in a lot of ways, we're not victims. We're all choosing this. We're each of us choosing to make these changes to protect strangers and the people that we love. We're choosing to value the lives of predominantly people who are in less good health or older. We're saying that we value them enough that we're willing to put our lives on hold to take care of them. So I know I've wondered this also, like we may have wondered how we'd measure up to previous generations. And I think that this is an opportunity for us all to prove that we, just like the generations that came before us, can sacrifice our own well-being and our own financial safety for the benefit of our families, our communities, and our country. So these are resources if anyone finds themselves in need of professional help, hotlines, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Danny, for that extremely substantive and informative presentation. I learned a lot. The definitions, the language, the suggestions and strategies for breaking some of these cycles was really so helpful. I took a ton of notes, and I'll ask you for the slides to send out to the community. We have a little bit of time, a few minutes, if people want to ask questions. You can unmute yourself. I'm a little bit reluctant to let Roy have the first question.
I'm sorry. You can drink. It's okay.
I mean, I was about to unmute him when you did that little low blow about alcohol, but my wife took my arm away from the button. I didn't want to derail the conversation too much because it might have gone that way. But I'll ask one question and others can maybe follow. And my question is, what if there is a piece of news or information about a family member or friend that you learn during the day that causes worry and anxiety that can't just be parked for later? So for instance, I learned that a dear friend, his father was intubated. And that caused me a lot of angst. I couldn't really focus on I couldn't get back to the activity that I was in the midst of because it was too intense of a concern for me. I couldn't just leave it for my 20-minute scheduled worry session later on. So what should I do? What should one do when that experience happens?
So I think that that it's really important also to practice self-compassion and to recognize that we feel emotions because we care about things, and that's a positive thing to feel strongly and to care deeply about someone, and that we can't always be at maximum efficiency, and the goal can't always be priority, and that we have to prioritize being human and allowing ourselves to feel strong emotion. So what I would say is that's the kind of thing I wouldn't want to park somewhere. Like I would want to sit and fully experience that. As painful as it is, that's we know what we value when we feel sad and we feel hurt and we feel worried. And I wouldn't want to anesthetize anyone against that by having them completely avoid their emotion. The worry time is more useful when you notice this habitual kind of pattern of anxiety preventing you from experiencing your life. But in that case, noticing and accepting the feelings that you're having, that is living your life. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, I think Roy's been waiting patiently. So, okay.
So I have a question for people that have lost their jobs or are running out of money, and they really do feel that they may benefit from speaking to a mental health professional, a psychologist. Is this a type of service that is typically covered by health insurance?
So yeah, it actually is. It hadn't been up until recently. There were a lot of insurance companies that would not cover, well, it's particularly now, telemental health had not been covered. So now there are many mental health professionals who are doing online therapy, so there's actually much greater availability than there had been previously. And yeah, the insurance companies typically will cover mental health. Even though there was a mental health parity law passed, I would not say that there's true parity. It still can sometimes be hard to get mental health things covered to the same degree, but insurance companies generally do cover. Actually, Karen knows better than I do about this.
Yeah,
that was my wife Karen. She's also a psychologist.
A lot of there are a lot of places that do offer telemedicine appointments now, and insurance companies now are covering services and even covering copays. So 100% of the service is being covered by insurance companies now.
That's helpful to know. As Danny put up on the screen, there are lots of services, and I also have several people that I refer to outside the community, but from people who I've known and have learned to trust and really respect. So I'd be happy to make any referrals if that would be helpful to anybody here or to anybody who somebody here knows. Other questions or comments for Danny? You have to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Okay, David, okay, Sharon Ravid, go ahead.
No, I just want to say thank you very much. And I loved your comment about the end of Western civilization, because, you know, that's sort of what it feels like, you know, sometimes to me. And you're basically saying, okay, so that's not a helpful thought, right? So you got 15 minutes in the morning, you know, to think about that. And the rest of the day, you know, you have other stuff to do. And Baruch Hashem, I have other stuff to do. So, you know, you get 15 minutes on that, and then you move on.
You've run.
I did.
Thank you, David. Sharon Ravid, if you want to unmute yourself, you can talk.
I'm sorry. Actually, I'm sorry. I missed the end of what you said, David, because my screen froze. I don't know if it froze for anyone else.
Oh.
I was just saying Yesher Koyach, basically, and emphasizing that I have similar, you know, thoughts, you know, in the course of the day, and I will try and you know, stick them in my 15 minutes in the morning and move on the rest of the day if I can.
Yeah, I think you'd find also it's remarkably effective. Like it's surprisingly difficult to worry when you're choosing to do it. It's much less enticing. Like worry when it happens accidentally it's so hard to ignore. But when you're choosing to do it, you'll find 15 minutes is going to feel hard to do. Even if under normal circumstances you might do it for an hour a day, when you're choosing to do it, you'll find probably that it's much less pleasant. It's not really as entertaining.
So my question was, there have been several topics covered in this series that Rabbi Chesses has been doing about parenting and marriage. A lot of the anxiety that's felt is around those domestic issues, like, are my kids learning in school? Or, you know, what kind of structure to my day? How can I get my work done? You talked about distancing yourself from the news when that's a trigger. What do you do when it's the people around you that you're stuck at home with who are bringing on the anxiety?
I tell my kids to be quiet. I mean, it's really difficult. I mean, I do believe that it's really difficult. I think one thing that, again, just to go back to self-compassion, I think we're all having a hard time with this to greater and lesser extents. It's a very difficult situation. It feels totally unnatural. I mean, ideally, you try to talk to them if there are things that you can identify that they could do. Try to get them to do them while also recognizing that we only have so much control over other people, and that everybody's dealing with this situation of heightened stress. So I at least within my own mind, I try to give more leeway to other people and to myself, but it's really hard to do in the moment. It's hard to remind yourself of the context when there's something that someone's doing that is just aggravating or disruptive when you're trying to do work. I can't tell you how many times I'm doing Skype therapy from my basement, and I can't tell you how many times I talk to people. I'm talking to a patient. They're like, "What is that? What does that sound? Like someone dying?" Like, no, that's children are playing upstairs. It's like these crazy smashing noises. I don't know what you guys are doing up there.
Do some crazy smashing.
Do some crazy smashing noises, yeah. But it's really hard. I think that the main thing to do, I guess, is one thing that I don't think I really talked about that much in this conversation is this idea of radical acceptance, of accepting the world as it is, and just accepting that the world is hard, that things are hard right now, and there might not be much that we can do about it. If there was a practical solution, I'm sure you would have thought of it already. So, yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions for Danny? Okay, well, we're coming up on about our time limit, so I want to thank everybody for joining and for taking this time to lean on and learn from each other, and especially want to thank Danny for being our teacher and being our guide. Really, it's such a privilege to be able to have you in our community and to benefit from your incredible knowledge. So thank you for sharing it with us. And I'll wish everyone a Lila Tov. And also, just on a scheduling note, we had originally planned the 4th in this series to be next week, but because it's also Erev, or it's the week before Shavuot next week, we might do something more Shavuot themed and push the final one to after Shavuot. But you'll get that change of plans in an email if that happens. So Lila Tov to all. Stay strong and stay healthy.
Laila Tov.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Danny.